Well, hello and welcome to the Rangers Journal. My name is Ross Graham, and tonight we're going to be taking a deep dive into Benfica, Rangers' opponents in the last 16 of the Europa League. I'm delighted to be joined by Albert and Barney. They are from the Long Ball Futebol Podcast, so check that out on Twitter, and they're Portuguese football specialists. They're going to be talking to us about Benfica's history, a bit about some of their key players and who to keep an eye on, their form this year, both in Europe and domestically, and also potentially some areas that Rangers can exploit. Fingers crossed. If you like this and the other content that we've got on the Rangers Journal, then please do like and subscribe. So, Albert and Barney, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you jumping on tonight. How are you both keeping?
Very good. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
No problem. Good. So, look, you've done me a favor by coming on. It wouldn't be fair if I didn't let you kind of plug your podcast and the stuff you do. So let's get that out of the way straight of all. So the Long Ball Futebol Podcast, talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's a weekly podcast. Well, mainly weekly podcast about Portuguese football. We cover Portuguese domestic football, so the Portuguese Primeira Liga, and of course we cover Benfica, as we're going to talk about today, Porto, Braga, Sporting, but also we try and cover all the stories from the Primeira Liga. You know, there's plenty of other teams in the league who give us amazing moments. Sort of, the Portuguese league is not quite a sort of Turkey or Greece level of chaotic, but you have a little bit of that element to it. So we get plenty of drama, plenty of excitement, loads of great young players. You know, so many incredible young players come through Primeira Liga. Players like, even recently, Darwin Nunes, we got to see for the first time in Europe in Portugal. So stuff like that. And yeah, we do a podcast every week. We just chat about all the best games, how the league's getting on, the best players. And yeah, it's always good fun. It's good for anyone who's sort of a European football fan and wants something that they don't normally get in terms of like French or German football, which is quite easily accessible.
Awesome. And are you Portuguese then, gents? Is that how the tie comes along?
No. I think we both just really like Portugal. I went there on holiday a few times, and Albert's been learning the language. He's gone a step further than me. But yeah, I mean, we just sort of. I was quite bored of the Premier League. I don't have a team. I used to say I support Paul Scholes, but like I've never had like a team that I just love football basically. And then I was bored of watching the Premier League, and then I was chatting to Albert, say, "Oh, I might do a random fantasy football league," and I thought, "Oh, maybe do Portugal," and then we just took it one step further. Like, yeah, maybe we'll do a podcast as well, and just throw ourselves into it.
If it's a holiday that got you into it, I can see why you don't follow the SPFL. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Look, we're here tonight to talk really about Benfica versus Rangers, last 16 of the Europa League. A crucial tie for both teams, I think it's fair to say. It will be next week's tie. I'm heading across to Lisbon, so looking forward to that one. Fantastic. And then obviously the return leg the following week back at Ibrox. For those listeners that are tuning in now that don't really know much about Benfica and kind of their position within footballing culture in Portugal, could you give us a bit of an intro to Benfica?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Benfica are, I think it's safe to say, undeniably the most famous Portuguese team, and have the most supporters both domestically and internationally. There are, of course, very, very fierce rivalries, and that's why I want to be careful what I say, because Porto fans will obviously argue about their position in the league and whether they are the biggest club in Portugal compared to Benfica. I have looked up a couple of things to try and get a picture of this. There is actually an all-time Primeira Liga table, which is based on going back to 1935, in which Benfica are actually second behind Porto. They have something like 50 to 70 wins less than Porto. So, you know, perhaps you could say that means they're the second best team in Portugal. I don't think it's really enough to say that. They definitely got the most fans domestically. They're definitely the most recognizable Portuguese team. And at the moment, in this moment in time, it's definitely fair to say also that they're the wealthiest Portuguese team. They are able to make signings on a level that even Porto and Sporting can't really compete with. They also have had the most success in the transfer market recently. They've had the most high profile transfer sales. I think they've sold two or three players for more than 100 million euros now. João Felix was one, and Enzo Fernandez was the most recent. So, they really are the financial powerhouse in Portugal, definitely the most supported team in Portugal. Whether or not they're historically above Porto, I don't think we can conclusively say that. But at this moment in time, definitely they are the kind of the powerhouse in Portugal, definitely.
Okay, interesting. I like to see you sat on the fence there. That's always good.
So I've got to be very careful.
Love to see it. Okay, great. So thanks for that intro. So looking at the league at the minute and kind of how things are panning out, Benfica sat on top. I think I'm right in saying there's a big game on tonight, and then another one next week with Porto. So tonight, for those listening, Sporting Lisbon v Benfica. Sporting Lisbon, a couple of points behind, game in hand, or a point behind, game in hand. Can leapfrog them and kind of take a step on. I'm sure there's not too many games left.
That's actually a cup game, so it doesn't affect the league. But the game on Sunday, huge game against Porto, the Clásico, that will have big ramifications on the title race, definitely.
Okay, interesting, great. So talk to me a bit about how they've kind of performed this year. Obviously brought in a lot of high profile players. Some of the players that the Rangers fans will recognise from last time. You mentioned before, Nunez, he scored against us, I think, to draw away in Benfica. Clearly now they've been able to bring in Angel Di Maria, a world-class footballer, World Cup winner. How have they been performing this year, both kind of domestically, clearly they're doing pretty well, but also in the European arena?
Yeah, they've well, as I was saying, they're certainly a powerhouse in Portugal at the moment, and with all these new signings. They won the league last year under Roger Smith, which was his first season as Benfica manager. This season, they once again were very active in the market. As you said, Di Maria coming in that's probably one of the biggest players. His status coming to Portugal at this time was absolutely huge. And they've done some very smart signings as well. Lots of players rumoured with various moves across Europe, like Koshu, the Turkish midfielder. But they managed to get him in, and some very exciting young players as well. What hasn't translated though is that momentum that Schmidt brought with him last season. I'm saying this and they're top of the league, but there's been it feels like they haven't made that step up, which in keeping with the signings they've made in the transfer window. They've had a bit of a few flat performances in the league, a few disappointing results as well. And I think actually in Europe as well, it's felt like a similar story. They've obviously got through to this stage of the Europa League, but there've been some disappointing results, and we've certainly come away from watching games in Europe thinking they should have beaten this team, and they haven't been able to. It seems to be the case that, or in my opinion anyway, that the quality of players they have in their squad has sort of helped them through at this point of the season. And it's not so much, maybe this is too harsh now, disagree with me, but Roger Smith seems to be holding them back a little bit. And this is all in the context of, them being top of the league, but this is the whole thing with Benfica and in Portuguese football. There are high standards, and with the rest of the league sort of very much nowhere near the level of the top teams. When you get a poor result, it feels really negative, and yeah, I think they felt underwhelming to me this season, despite being top of the table.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. I'm not sure about your knowledge of the SPFL, but there certainly has been historically a gulf between the top teams and the teams in the rest of the table. And you're only a draw away from a disaster is kind of the term we always say. So interesting that you've said that. A couple of questions. The first one you mentioned about kind of the quality players carrying them through. Do you think Benfica's aspirations, having brought in these top-level players, are to be successful in Europe or to be consistently winning at home? What do you think that aspiration is? With big investment, usually there comes big expectations.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for a club like Benfica, in a way, domestic success is almost expected. That's kind of the baseline, and it goes back to what Barney was saying about almost being underwhelmed despite them being top of the table, because in many ways, being top of the table is the baseline of what Benfica expects. Doing well in domestic cups is expected. I think in terms of signings and the financial model of the club, I think it's fair to say that selling on players is a reasonable expectation. So a lot of signings are made not just to sign quality players, but also to sign players of a certain age demographic, which means they'll be able to sell them on in the future, or from certain regions where perhaps they've not been seen by European clubs before, and then they can sell them on in that way. And I'm thinking particularly of players they signed from South America. But for a club like Benfica, it's always, if they win the league and win the biggest Portuguese cup, it's not even necessarily been a season that the fans will think, oh, I'm always going to remember that season, because chances are they'll probably do that same thing again within the next 3 to 5 years. So European success is obviously very different, and the Champions League this year was a big disappointment, and I think an aspect of them perhaps being a bit flat in the league in the first part of the season was struggling to deal with playing in Europe and playing domestically. I can't remember exactly how many games it was, but they lost multiple games in the Champions League in a row. They didn't get a win in ages. I think they ended with 4 points in a group, and it was a tough group. It had Real Sociedad, Inter, and RB Leipzig, I think. So, all good teams, and you're not necessarily guaranteed results against any of those teams, but also Benfica by no means minnows in that group. So that was a bit of a disappointment. But Champions League football is, unfortunately, Portugal, and perhaps I think, there are quite a few similarities between Portugal and Scotland in terms of in football and how the league is, like you say, it's a kind of a 2-team league, and Scotland is pretty much a 3-team league in Portugal, and how, if we're being honest, perhaps these are leagues that once were the jewels in the crown of European football and now have kind of fallen behind the traditional top 5. Well, in fairness. So I think, for Benfica, there is a kind of disparity between European football and domestic football, where domestic success is expected, but European success is something that they haven't really had in quite a long time.
Yeah, okay. Well, it feels like the clubs are potentially at different stages. I think Rangers are at the stage where we're trying to establish that stronghold in the league and be consistent winners of the league, which we've kind of flirted with over the past couple of years, but never been able to get over the line, apart from when we had Gerrard in. And I think you're right in what you say about this. There's the kind of the big leagues where the money is, the investment, the sponsorships, etc. And then there's the other leagues that are kind of periphery, that maybe have to work on a player trading model. It's something that Rangers want to bring in, and probably look at clubs like Benfica, Porto, where they've had that talent coming in and been able to release that on for huge profit, as a great example of how that can be done well. Cool. So moving on then, we mentioned Roger Schmidt earlier. Talk to me a bit about kind of what he's brought to the club, the expectations that are on his shoulders, and I guess kind of how he's received with the fans.
Yeah, I think the thing with Roger Schmidt is when he first arrived, it was after failed tenure of Jorge Jesus, who's quite a famous Portuguese manager, but and quite a character. And he was, well, Benfica had spent a lot of money under him, and then he had failed to deliver any sort of success. And so we also had Rui Costa, the Portuguese legend, AC Milan legend, become president of Benfica as well. And with his arrival, and then Roger Schmidt, it felt like very much a new era. And as I said, last year they did extremely well to win the league. But I think a lot of that was, well, certainly now I feel like a lot of that was to do with the release of not being under this cloud of misery of, the old president and Jorge Jesus. It was just to have someone new, someone from outside of Portugal as well coming in. I think that gave a lot of players at that club a sort of a relief, and I think that's why they were so successful last year. I think what we've seen happen this season play out is teams getting a bit wise to Roger Schmidt and his sort of lack of. Well, Roger Schmidt's very much a person who likes to be, I'll say, cautious. He's very much about balance. He's not someone who's going to throw caution to the wind. He's not someone who's going to change up anything drastically. He sets out a team who he feels are going to be able to press well, defend well, keep it solid, and sort of hope those and then the attacking players sort of create something themselves. In we've seen a lot this season. As I said, teams sort of work that out, and teams, the smaller teams have success when they've able to sort of just attack from the off. And then Roger Smith seems to be a manager who doesn't like to change things during a game either. He's very slow to react, sticks to his ways, and sort of just expects the results to come in, and that hasn't happened. Fans have sort of become a bit upset about that because, as we've all spoken about, the squad at Benfica is ridiculously talented, and particularly depth, which you don't often get in this Portuguese league. The amount of money they've spent and the quality of players they have on the bench, and to see him not use those players, he very much has his trusted players that he likes to play. One of the stand-up players has been he's in Norwegian. Sorry, I've forgotten about Ausnes. Yeah, he came from Holland, but a central midfielder who's been playing left back for the whole season, and they've signed left backs and they have left backs available, but he's stuck with a player like Ausnes because he trusts him. And similar to João Mario, sort of the famous Portuguese player who was at Inter for a bit and West Ham. Another player who fans aren't so taken with because he's, there's other players there who have the skill and the flair and that that little bit of that spark, but yes, João Mario will be playing because he brings that stability, that sort of and that, like I said, that's had mixed results, because last year it served them very well, but this year, and as Albert said, in Europe, it was evident that it didn't work, and the sort of the reluctance to change, and particularly during games, is really been evident this season.
Yeah, and look, I think as a Rangers fan, I'm sure a lot of the Rangers fans watching this will be able to echo that. Watching a game and you can see something crying out for a spark or someone different to come on and change things up, and it not coming to fruition on the pitch is a very frustrating thing. I think one thing for context, with Philippe Clement, who's come in at Rangers, he seems to be humble enough to make a change at half time, humble enough to make those changes, which is great from a fan's point of view. And at the weekend, last night actually against Kilmarnock, he made changes at half time to completely flip the game on its head. So it is a good thing to see from a fan's point of view. Before we get on to some of the key players and I guess kind of Schmid's real sort of style of play on the pitch, I just was interested to understand what the press and I guess the population's perception was when the draw was made at Neon the other week at Rangers versus Benfica. What was the reaction?
I think it really depends who you listen to. I mean, I definitely did see, predictably, some of sort of fan accounts on Twitter saying, "Great draw, we couldn't have asked for a better draw than this." But then I don't think that was something really echoed by anyone in the media or really any fans who've kind of know more what they're talking about. I don't think that was really a sentiment. I don't think it's necessarily incorrect for either Rangers or Benfica fans to be mildly pleased with this draw, because the fact remains that there are bigger teams in the draw that were avoided, Liverpool, AC Milan, stuff like that. So from that perspective, it could have been worse. But I think Portuguese fans, Benfica fans and neutrals as well, will still have memories of even recently playing Braga in the Europa League and how that went. And I think that was a real kind of we saw how strong a team like Rangers can be, and Braga, would have gone, okay, well, we've got a chance to go through here, but I think they were beaten pretty well in over 2 legs. So I don't think people are really underestimating this. Of course, it could have been worse, but in general, I think I think people are looking forward to a good game, and I think in Portugal, there's a lot of respect for the kind of atmosphere and stuff that you get at Ibrox. I remember when Rangers played Braga, the Portuguese media was really kind of taken with the atmosphere and the fan footage and the fireworks and all that kind of stuff. So I think in that sense, people are looking forward to there is a lot of mutual respect, I think. But make no mistake, Benfica will be aiming to win this game, and they will believe that it's within their power to do so. Definitely.
Yeah, and look, I think on paper both Rangers and Benfica probably would have been quietly confident or at least satisfied with the draw. I think that's fair thing to say. I think from a Rangers point of view, we know that we can if we stay firm out there, we've always got a chance when we get back to Ibrox.
Yeah.
I think the results that we, you mentioned earlier, beating RB Leipzig isn't for everyone, but it certainly was for us a few years ago. And long, that stays long in the memory. Great. Well, thanks for that. So let's talk a bit more about the tie. So Benfica v Rangers first. As I mentioned, it's next week, next Thursday. Talk to me a bit about some of the key players on the night from a Benfica point of view and who Rangers really need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for me, the player who's really in form at the moment is Rafa. He's a really interesting player for me because his form fluctuates, and for the few years we've been watching this league and watching him, there's 1 week I'm saying on our podcast, this guy's world class. Why is he not a big club? And then the next week I'm like, this guy, what? I can see why he hasn't got that move. I would say this year though, however, I feel like he's come to the end of his contract, and he's made a few comments and indicate he might be leaving. I don't know if that's the reason why, but he certainly feels a bit more consistent this season. And in his last few games especially, he's just looked so confident. They just won, was it 6-2 against Bizella? And he was scoring like outside of the foot shots, a beautiful Trevor cross. Like he's brimming with confidence. In that game, he was playing as a striker, which is the first time this season that's happened because Roger Schmidt's been toying with. He's had a couple of options in the striking position: Artur Cabral, Kasper Tengstedt, both who have not really impressed at all, and he seems to have rotated. So in this game, to see Rafa playing as that main man up top and that license to just roam across the width of the pitch, he's great, and he looks really dangerous. Whether Schmidt does that against Rangers, we'll have to see. But for me, that was possibly Benfica at their best this season. And of course, Di Maria, who we've mentioned, who just brought that real class. Like it was obvious as that was going to happen because he's been so good. And was he 36? But it's still and he's still just incredible, and he creates so much. So for me, but out of everyone, I'd say Rafa. I'm not sure if Albert have got anyone else to offer because there's been quite a few impressive performances recently. But for me, I'll say Rafa's the danger man.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that.
Okay, great. So looking at it from a Rangers lens, then we've talked about who the kind of key players are from attacking from a I guess positive point of view. Where do you think Rangers can unsettle Benfica? Where do you think the points of weakness are that we could look to exploit?
Well, I feel like, I'm not sure if this is just me, but I feel like this is the same answer for most clubs. And it's probably, if you're going to pick any weaknesses, it will be fullback. And depending if that player that Barney mentioned, Frederick Algenes, plays at left back, perhaps I would specify as well, left back, if perhaps if he doesn't play there, if Schmidt opts to play him in midfield, or sometimes he's even played him in the front three. That could be an area because they've signed a new young Spanish left back from Manchester United. His name escapes me, but he's pretty untested. So perhaps that could be an area of weakness. And on the other side, at right back, they have a Danish fullback called Alexander Barr, who actually has been pretty impressive. And I do like Barr, so it's pretty solid there. But yeah, left back, they've basically been rotating through Frederick Algenes, who's very solid and does an admirable job, actually, even though he's basically a defensive midfielder, of playing an attacking fullback, and he's right-footed, but he's a real utility player. So he's done an admirable job, although perhaps at the European level, not the most spectacular player. They've also been rotating with a left-footed, basically a left-footed centre-back called Morato, who that kind of tells you everything you need to know about the way he plays. Defensively solid, but perhaps not, again, a marauding left back, although he does, again, admirably sort of get involved when he needs to. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think Benfica have a pretty solid team, and they've done pretty well at plugging gaps where there were previously areas. Like, for example, goalkeeper was a bit of a problem area under their previous goalkeeper, Vlachodimos, who actually got a move to the Premier League with Nottingham Forest, but that's a different story. But they've replaced him pretty well with a keeper called Anatoly Trubin, who has looked very solid. He's a young keeper they bought from Shakhtar Donetsk, I believe. So there's not huge problem areas, but definitely left back, I think, depending who they play, and it'll be interesting to see who they do pick on the day, is an area where perhaps they don't have the most spectacular choices.
Can I just come in, because I was listening to podcast from last week about I heard listening to you talk about Yilmaz and Cortez, right? Your left hand side, and I was thinking about Benfica's right hand side. As Albert mentioned, Barr is a great right back, and he's back from injury for the last few weeks, so he's been a real boost to that team. And I've just spoken about Di Maria as well, but what you don't get from Di Maria is that defensive cover, right? And Barr is quite well. I think he's quite an attacking fullback as well. So whether those spaces there can open up, and then you're looking at coming into Antonio Silva, the young centre back who's had a breakthrough season last year. I think he's 18, 19 years of age, a hell of a player, but he's still young, and I haven't seen many performances where I felt that he seems that bit inexperienced. He's an incredible player, but I don't know, on that side of the fence might be the area that you'll have the best bet. The other thing I had is just midfield and the creative players in that midfield. Whether I think that's probably going to cost you the Turkish players we mentioned. He's been playing slightly deeper for Benfica than he likes. He does play as a 10, but he's sort of been playing in a sort of double pivot. Sure. And the games they struggle is when they haven't been able to create. He hasn't been given that space. He hasn't been able to get forward because he's having to work too much. And so that's an area that I think could be Rangers could get out as well.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, look, guys, I'm going to wrap this up shortly. So I just want to say thanks again very much for joining us. It's great to hear the insider knowledge. But before I do, the first thing I want to ask is a scoreline prediction. So Albert, I'll hand over to you, and watch your follow account either go up or go down depending on your answer.
Is this for the home leg or for both legs?
Well, let's have both then. Go on.
Oh, I mean, it's hard to predict. I think from experience, I'm inclined to say the leg at Ibrox is where this will be won or lost. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that Benfica take a lead after the home leg. Might not be loads. It might not be what they're used to doing in the league when they're playing against smaller Portuguese teams, scoring 3, 4, 5 goals. But I think, Benfica are, a great team. I don't want to disrespect anyone by predicting a Benfica win. But I think, Benfica are a great team. They're going to have a starting 11 of hundreds of millions of pounds worth of transfers on the pitch. So, this is a team with pedigree and great players. And I think they can probably win at home. But the away leg is where I start to get nervous. So I think unless Benfica can perform really well, and if they can perform really well and play at their best, I think they can hurt Rangers at home with maybe 2 goals, maybe 3, possibly if things go really well. But I think if the scoreline is more like a 1-goal lead or a draw or Rangers lead, of course, after the home leg, then I think the ball is really in Rangers' court after that. So the first leg for me will be pivotal. It's really tight. I don't want to sit on the fence. I think I would, as a Portuguese podcast, I'll back Benfica to go through. But if they do, it won't be easy. And I think it's going to be, a tough 2 legs for both teams, I think.
Great. Okay. I think just on that point, and one thing I was going to say earlier, it's a very interesting dynamic for Rangers and possibly Benfica as well, because when you're used to playing some of the teams in the leagues, you're playing against the low block, it's more of a battle of wits and tiring them out and persistence to try and break through that low block. I think when it comes to these European ties, it's very interesting to see a team come out and play against you and actually try and progress the ball forward, commit men forward. And I think I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think that's where Rangers play best. And I think we're best when we can expose them. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens on the night. Barney, over to you. Hope you're not going to be on the fence as well, pal.
No, it just came to me in my head. After hearing you just say that, if Rangers were to get an early goal, they lose. But I'm going to say 3-0 to Benfica first leg, and then I think I see it going to Ibrox. I think you get 2 goals, and then it's just a cagey last end to the game. And at that point, it could be anyone's, because I think Benfica could crumble in that situation. And then, extra time, I think you've got it. But yeah, maybe I'll go 3-2, 3-0 first leg, 2-0 second leg.
Okay. All right. Well, look, Albert, Barney, thank you so much for joining us on the Rangers Journal. If you've enjoyed this pod, if you enjoyed this stream, then please do like and subscribe. Thanks very much. Good night.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.